Okay, we'll see how it goes.
Okay. We're live, so I'll say hello to the audience as they join in. I'm Dav, this is Dav Chat, and I have the honor today of talking with investigative journalist Jonathan Greenberg, who is the investigative journalist who's been investigating Trump for longer than anyone else, and who has written some important pieces for the Washington Post, one that I typically share with my readers called Saving Face, about the strategies that Trump used to essentially extort and manipulate the media or people in the media landscape in order to control the narrative. Jonathan's also the person who Trump called pretending to be John Barron, the vice president of finance in the Trump organization. And Jonathan Greenberg has been live on media talking about that previously, but today he's talking to us. So thank you, Jonathan. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you, Dav. It's a pleasure being here.
So your new projects that are coming out are a dystopian novel called 2034.
And America 2034, Utopia Rising.
Utopia Rising. And you wrote that to address the threat that you think Trump poses to democracy, I guess, and to perhaps make it more vivid for Americans now to understand what can happen when you have an unethical person.
It's a cautionary tale. And it's based upon, I first interviewed Trump in 1982 for the Forbes 400. And and I've been writing about him right up until this moment. I've got another piece coming out soon about him. But where I've been going the last, most recently, is this sense of this, it's a cautionary tale, America 2034, that opens with Trump stealing the 2020 election on November 2nd. By declaring a state of emergency based upon a false flag operation, a few bombs that are set in polling places, in the middle of the night, and they blow up. And he says, we've got to protect this. I'm declaring a state of emergency to assume the emergency powers and seize federal control over the polling places, the registrations, and the vote counting, and to steal the election as the way he wins the election. And what that's about is the extraordinary depth, the extraordinary powers that our Constitution and legal practice and our the tradition of American government gives to a president who declares a state of emergency. Enough to, in a sense, trump the power of states who are constitutionally empowered to control the vote counting in their states. So he's able to bring in his federal agents, and the book is a cautionary tale about what that looks like. What does a Trump dystopia look like? What would happen if, based upon him winning the next election, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is 87 years old, gets replaced? And in addition to the 4 rubber stamp cronies that he currently has on the court, Roberts is a wild card for him.
Yes.
He now has 5 Kavanaugh-like justices to basically rubber stamp any display of power. And it's built upon, any power that he takes, including outlawing the press and rewriting the Constitution to stop term limits and to basically brand anyone who opposes him or his policies as a traitor and incarcerate and prosecutes using the full power of the Justice Department. And the book seems far-fetched on some level, but when you take it apart and you look at, okay, what is there within this story that the Republican enablers in the Senate and in Congress, and who he has now basically cherry-picked by everybody else voting themselves off the island or being fired, who would not carry out his illegal orders. What is there about this book, which is a spinoff of 1984, set in Trump's 16th year as president for life? What is there in there that any of them would actually stand up and say, no, we, the Senate, are going to vote to impeach you for? And of course, there's nothing. There is nothing he could do more evident than what he's done. And so that's the basis of the of this dystopian novel. And what I'm doing, and the reason I'm on your show, and the reason what I'm looking to talk about is to really say to people who say, I've spoken to people. There are people out there who say, it doesn't matter who gets elected. Politicians, I had a 25-year-old man who's a PhD student in Florida say, they're all the same. The politicians, doesn't matter who gets elected. They're only in it for themselves. I'm not voting. And and to say to someone like that and say, hey, you know what? What's happened so far hasn't impacted you. Here's a mirror into the future. This is what it looks like. How do you like that one? Because that's what we are likely to get if he gets reelected or is allowed to steal this election.
You've attempted to make it more real for those people who seem incapable of making historical comparisons and saying Trump untethered himself from reality when he began to be a liar who wasn't held accountable. When he took advantage of that tendency in American media to give equal weight to assertions from different camps on the grounds of fair-mindedness, whereas that always privileges liars. If you give equal weight and treat with equal deference people from two political parties, regardless of the fact that one is an abusive liar who makes his policies and who makes his statements all about gratifying people at an emotional level rather than being a responsible person who deals in verifiable reality. So Trump's created a second reality that's what fascists do, and that's a pattern that's repeated across time and history. But some Americans don't like to look across history and they don't like to look internationally. So you've tried to make it more vivid and more visceral for people who only want to think in American terms, to say, okay, America hasn't had to deal with a charlatan who's got this far before. The founders envisaged having someone who might be beholden to foreign interests. They envisaged this type of sellout, and they tried their hardest to preclude that with regulations and the emoluments clause and other things. But Trump is a person of the moment. Not only is he a charlatan, but he has willing cooperators in the Republican Party who seem to be pursuing one-party power. So nothing that Trump does irks them enough to stand up. And I don't like to say they don't have spines. Lots of people say they don't have spines. I like to say we under-acknowledged how far they're willing to go in pursuit of power, that they fear political obsolescence because of the changing demographics of the United States, that there's no longer going to be a white majority at some point in the near future. So how did you describe how America responds to this dystopian situation where Trump has used a Reichstag false flyer type situation to take command over the votes from the states and rig the election? In your book, how do people respond to that situation? Are there little pockets of resistance, or what happens?
Well, the two things. First is that he declares martial law and blacks out all media and communications, and that when he's stolen the election and he emerges having won, there is this massive march on Washington planned for over 2 million people, as well as in every capital. And he declares martial law, and he orders the troops to open fire on them. And he also rounds up all organizers and puts them in these concentration camps, basically, that expand, and they're private prison camps, basically, that are slave labor camps, and they become a network of slave labor camps that by 2034, there are over 100 million Americans in slave labor camps. There's also 100 million Americans who live in something called the United Peoples of America, which is a West Coast utopia created behind a force field in the states of California, Oregon, and Washington. That exists in a state of the most harmonious utopia that's ever existed on Earth, because people have activated the oneness gene inherent in all people to collaborate as opposed to compete. And it's a matriarchal, enlightened society in which I wrote something in the Huffington Post. Let me back up for a second and I'll diverge. I wrote something in the Huffington Post where I did a political blog in the few years leading up to Trump's election. And I said that Trump represents everything that is wrong with the American male, that he is a embodiment, in a sense, of the toxic masculinity and the everything that's wrong with the patriarchy. And I felt that we all have male and female, men have in some cases, more qualities, but those male qualities that are most toxic are those of fear, anger, violence, competition, and the female qualities, or the qualities of the patriarchy, are compassion, cooperation, and love. And those qualities are the things that lift and have throughout society, lifted our better selves. But Trump is he's the sexual assaulter, the braggadocious, the anger, the sexual abusive, the lying, the cheating. All these things are like, if you associate like, or that.
Oh, the connection's breaking up a little bit, Jonathan. Rats. You're frozen, so hold your thoughts, and I'll continue to talk and hope that your connection's restored soon. I'll reflect on what you've just told me, because it sounds like you're trying to highlight almost the Jungian archetypes of Hitler as like a Nietzschean Übermensch who often arises when you have some conditions in a society where people start to pretend that they need more defense. They're so persecuted, they need someone who's willing to harm social norms or harm humanitarian considerations in favor of protecting their interests. So white people who watch Fox News, I would imagine, have been so... Hi, Jonathan. I'm just in a train of thought reflecting on what I think your novel is trying to encapsulate. That if the Fox viewing audience has been conditioned to believe for so many years now that their interests are being ignored or overridden, and that they are the persecuted people in American society, that gives rise to that hunger for a maladaptive uber male who is the strong man to defend their interests, who is the bully who will bully bullies on their behalf. And those abraded, that grievance culture can give rise to a hunger for someone like Trump, or at least create opportunity, create space for someone like Trump to flourish to a certain extent. And you've gone and tried to create a counterbalance to that as well and said, okay, what is the theoretical extreme counterweight to Trump? And you've said a matriarchy with compassion and less of the hyper capitalism, vulture capitalism qualities that America currently has in excess, or to excess a little bit. Some would argue, many would argue, but not everyone.
Yes, it's this sense of us, of caring about the common good, as opposed to getting as much as you can, and what impact that has on it. I mean, he is a malignant narcissist, and he is playing that what's called the white male Christian grievance card in a way that nobody else has ever imagined or thought to play it before. And it is the I mean, some people might call it the death throes or the last dying gasp of the toxic patriarchy.
We'll see.
All that is manifest in that. And I don't say that we have to have women running everything, but it sure would be a lot better world if we had them at least participating, and in 50% of the cases, at least 50% of the Congress, which I do believe
we might get a vice presidential female candidate, which I think is a great way to shoehorn in an eventual female president, because it just boiling the frog, but in a nice sense of getting people to get used to the idea of a female in that position of power. Oh, wait, it's not that scary. It doesn't mean all men have to give up status or privilege. Anyway, yes. I'm just going to my
and I think she will reflect I absolutely think that's how we're coming to our first female president, and I think it's going to happen soon. I don't know if it will take 4 years, but I do really think it's unlikely Biden will run for re-election. So that's how we get a female president, and she will compare probably pretty positively. And I must say, Biden who is not even close, he wasn't on my top 5 list for president.
Yes.
I am a Bernie supporter, or have been, and I like Elizabeth Warren a great deal as well. But
I can tell by the way you talked about capitalism.
What's that?
I can tell by the way you talked about capitalism before. You were like the qualities of competition, and you were focused on the toxicity of that, the excesses of capitalism. And
the common good. I mean, we're supposed to have a government. If you want to just talk about governing for a second, or governance, I mean, government exists to deliver, to deliver
utilitarian benefits to the people.
Benefits for the common good.
Maximize the common good, yes.
Right, and I'm what's called a reformist capitalist, which is to say that reformist is a constant. It's a constant. You basically have to tweak the system of taxation, and you have to tweak regulation, and you have to stop monopolization, and you have to really regulate so that the corporations and the enterprise capitalism works for the benefit of us and the planet, which includes pricing, polluter pays, and pricing externalities, and taxing, those who act, irresponsibly, and allocating that money to people to farm carbon and do things. All these things, by the way, are in the utopian society. All of the concepts of how we reform our system, both politically and economically, are there in the utopian system. And one other thing I'll say about the book, America 2034, Utopia Rising, is that it has a happy ending. Okay. So I don't know. Have you ever reread, Deb? Have you reread 1984 recently, or
not recently? No,
It's dark.
It's a little dark. It's a little dark, and reality is so dark.
It's got no hope. I mean, the whole resistance in 1984 is a ploy to draw out those who might want to resist, so that they could annihilate them. So there'll never be any resistance. It's diabolical. That doesn't exist here. There's a lot of sacrifice. There's some unexpected twists and turns and a lot of hardship, but they do win in the end. And I'm hoping it doesn't. We will win in the end of 2020. Okay, that we don't have to wait till 2034 and things to get like that. And that's why I'm out here talking now.
Well, there's a resistance here now, and I'm sure maybe elements have been infiltrated by fake accounts, but it's not as bleak as 1984 in that there is a strong vein of awareness. People were accused initially of hyperbole, but it is gratifying in this moment that so many more people now are at least starting to talk about Trump in terms of being an aspirational dictator, that they talk in terms of someone who lies, someone who seeks to subvert the rule of law, and who has handy assistants that are really facilitating those goals, like William Barr, so that, yes, I think America won't lie down that easily. And
but
good to describe it, to show people it's not a guarantee. There is no mandate that we will get out of this in November.
No, there's no mandate that he won't steal the election. The voter suppression efforts are so effective and so great in every red state. I mean, this has been a long time coming. I mean, the 2012, Supreme Court decision that you didn't have to, we have a black president, so therefore there's no racism in these former Confederate states. We no longer have to have to worry about them passing laws to disenfranchise people of color. And the day after they made that decision, the state legislatures in North Carolina and in every state legislature that had a Republican state majority, which were many of them, began to pass laws to disenfranchise. And they did it in Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina. It's astonishing how quickly it happened, and how effective it's been. And then they strike people from the, from the ballot box. They hire private companies to remove people's names from voter registrations with whatever reasons they have. So there's already, as Greg Palast is writing about, who's a great journalist writing about the stealing of the election, there's already a built-in disadvantage.
Yes.
And then there's the voting machines and the Russian hacking. But the one that I believe that the numbers are strong enough, and that the turnoff will be strong enough, that that Trump will lose in enough of a landslide that he can't, with Russia's help.
He can't manipulate it. Yeah.
He could manipulate. I believe that in the state legislatures, I can't even believe I'm saying this now, because it's pathetic, because it's so freaking obvious that in the state legislatures that are controlled by Republican governors and Republican secretaries of state in legislatures, that if it's within 0.5% or 1%, Trump is going to be able to steal those votes with the voting machines. That's what I believe that exists. I believe they're not secure. Everyone has seen them not be secure. But I do think that when it gets to the point of 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%, there's nothing they could do with that type of, no matter how they try, the fingerprints will show.
Well, sure. They've, like the catchphrase says, vote in numbers too big to manipulate, that you need the margin to be so healthy. And circumstances are pointing in that direction, that there's a historic crisis that is too vivid a contradiction to Trump's confected reality. That Trump is trying to still whip up a culture war and saying the true threat to Americans is the statues being torn down and the boogeyman of Antifa that's coming to get you. That's why you have to patrol your suburban.
I wonder, Dav, whether culture war is too polite a term. You know what term I'm thinking of?
What term?
Race war.
Race war. I don't like
I'm
to
not
say
saying
that.
it's happened. I mean, culture war is the term we know. That's the term of art.
Yeah.
But what he appeals to is not that your culture is under attack. It's that your race is under attack. And, I think it's a time, Dab, where we commentators or pundits begin to use the F word for fascism and the R word for racist.
Yes. Yes. The only reason why sometimes I favor an indirect approach to talking about that race war is because in itself, it has more of a galvanizing effect on them than it does on us. It's an intimidating term. So when they hear the term race war, they're like, yeah, let's get into it. I mean, there's the whole Boogaloo movement. They're the accelerationist movement because they want to bring about a race war. You saw Dylan Roof shoot people in Charleston because he wanted to instigate a race war, believing that it was inevitable and wanting to have control over it. So that's why I don't use that term, because to me, it's too exciting for them. That's it. That's interesting.
I hear you. And so is, and the term fascist is triggering to them as well. I mean, it's an interesting question. I want to get to where we are in history because you bring that up. So that being said, that we could win with big turnout, et cetera, is true. And I believe we are headed there, with the big caveat that brings me out and keeps me up at night and exists in the book, which is that he steals the election. He steals the election with by declaring a state of emergency. And the reasons I believe that, and I'd like to talk about that for a few minutes because people think that's far-fetched. Because I think that and this is the beginning of I'm planning to write about this and do more media appearances to talk about this, and I'd like to see it talked about more in general, is that if you look at everyone from Michael Cohen to Nancy Pelosi to Adam Schiff to even Joe Biden, who says his number one worry is not that Trump's gonna win re-election, but that Trump will not leave or accept the vote after the fact. And this is where, and Pelosi has said that, and Michael Cohen says he won't leave, and everyone said, oh my gosh, what are we gonna, have to call in people to move him? We should be so freaking lucky, Dav. We should be so lucky.
What do you mean?
Because Trump does not ask for forgiveness. He does. I'm sorry. He doesn't ask for permission. He basically is like, ask for, he's like, what are you going to do about it? He is always the way the malignant narcissist criminal mind of Donald Trump works is not that he says, let's see what happens, and afterward I'll contest it. He says, I'm going to make sure I don't lose. I'm going to declare a state of emergency. I'm going to steal this election. I'm going to make sure I don't lose. And that's where the state of emergency comes in. And that's where my concern is that everybody's looking at, after the fact. When I say we should be so lucky, he's going to do it before the fact. He's going to do it in the right. He's going to, and what I'm seeing, and I'd like to discuss these for a minute, are trial balloons that he is setting up to see what happens. Now, let me ask you, Michael Flynn, you ever wonder why he's going after changing the Justice Department and the prosecutor? And I haven't heard this discussed anywhere, but I see this as an indicator. So Michael Flynn, he could pardon Michael Flynn on November 10th, on December 1st, on January 1st. Pardon Michael Flynn and Roger Stone like that.
Yeah.
The president departing, that's when they do their pardons. Why is he going after the Justice Department to say, we are going to remove the prosecution from Mark? Because he wants to see that Barr will do whatever he says, no matter how illegal it is. And guess what? Check. Barr will do that. He wants to.
Barr will do anything. Barr is like a co-conspirator. Absolutely. He's not someone even who's obsequious to Trump. He is a leader in that movement as well, of installing right-wing dominions.
What about Trump's judges? Well, a 2-person majority in the D.C. Court of Appeals in a 3-person jury, his judges just voted to rubber stamp the most insane act. You're going to remove, he's pleaded guilty, but you're going to say we shouldn't have prosecuted him in the first place? No question about his guilt. No question. But they removed the prosecution, and the judges said, yes, we'll rubber stamp this. So that, to me, it's like, why is he doing that? He's doing that to make sure he can get away with it when he does the big move that I fear he will do if we are not aware and don't, and the people and the states, and the governors of these states and the people of these states don't stop it from happening. And that big move is, part 2, the mail-in ballots. He is totally upset about mail-in ballots. Voter fraud, millions of voters, illegals, immigrants.
Yeah, he's upset about it, and he sounds upset, which makes him seem disempowered, which is heartening to many of us to see him sound afraid of mail-in ballots and the fact that they are less easily disposed of than the hackable voting machines. So I think people are excited to think that they can mail in ballots. But of course, on this broadcast, we always remind people to mail in ballots 7 to 10 days before the actual election, so they have time to process them. So it doesn't become one of those situations where on election day, they start reading out the votes from the in-person voting, and then that favors Trump because that's more Republicans doing that. And Democrats
mail in 2 weeks in advance. And the great thing about doing that is those are the votes that they do mail in. They do count that very first moment. The moment the polls close, those are the numbers they read, is the number of the mail-ins that they've counted already. And so that's a very good point. But the reason he's challenging is not because he's worrying out loud, but he's delegitimizing those and giving, in the book, I meant to say, when he declares a state of emergency, he invalidates all mail-in ballots. Says you have to appear in polling places in person, where he has his Homeland Security or National Guard and federal agents going through the registrations. And he compares that registrations against a list of illegal immigrants, the 11 million people who are here illegally. And it just so happens that your name, for example, is Maria Gonzalez. And look at this. There are 8 Maria Gonzalez's in this state, but I voted here for the last, 30 years. My great-grandparents came here. I've been voting all this time. Okay, here's a provisional ballot, sweetheart. Now go take it over there, and we'll flush it down the toilet with the other provisional ballots. But they won't count them unless Trump's Trump loses, and he won't lose. So the concept is, and this goes back to the year 2000, when Secretary of State Harris in the state of Florida, hired this company using, that's when Jeb Bush was the Florida governor. They had both houses of the Florida state legislature, and they hired the Secretary of State, spent $2 million on a private company for a list of felons who might try to vote. And they compared the list to registered voters. And then they challenged that list. Even if your name was James C. Brown and there was someone named James R. Brown or just James Brown, they were like, okay, you're a felon. They went through a list and took 100,000 people's names off the voting rolls in the year 2000. Everyone was talking about hanging chads and 600 votes here and 20 votes here. No, they of those 100,000, almost all of them were African American, and a majority of them should not have been taken off. There was no grounds for appeal. The instruction of this private company was, if it seems similar, cross it off.
Yes.
And let them appeal.
That's so anti-democratic. That's extraordinary.
So in my book, chat, what I think is going to happen, Dab, is that they do this to people with Latino names, people who, again, and they have this federal registry across the state, and they disenfranchise millions of people at the polling place.
They can do that. They can do that. But even the revulsion of white suburban mums now is so great. Even white working class women are turning against Trump because you have this extraordinary crisis of the coronavirus that's going to escalate. You might like this, Jonathan, because I've been sharing with people some results from a Navigator research survey that showed that independent voters who know someone who has been infected with the coronavirus are 15 points less likely to approve of Trump.
Wow.
So even as the tragedy, and it has a 5% difference for Republican voters. So you're a Republican voter, you're already sufficiently fox brainwashed that even when you know someone who's infected, you still keep pushing ahead with your Trump defenses, or the effect is weaker or takes longer. But for independent voters who have a greater degree of intellectual integrity at this point in time, they know someone infected, it overturns their assumptions about Trump. Instead of saying, no, he's just a beleaguered, kindly president who's maybe, a bit of a bully and a bit of a bad behaved person, but he's fundamentally still looking after Americans, it overturns those assumptions for them, and they 15-point average fall. So as the coronavirus spreads, and it's raging uncontrolled through a lot of states.
It's terrible.
And even when we say a state is a red state, that doesn't mean everyone in that state is a red.
But you look at Arizona, Texas, and Florida.
Yeah.
And they've got their highest rates ever. And the death rate hasn't soared because there's this pause between the infection and the death rate.
There's a lag, and young people get infected first because they're the most socially mobile. They're in the mating stage of their lives and they're trying to find partners. So they still go out and they fill the available space when it's legal to do so. And it has a trickle-down effect, much more real than any economics trickle-down effect that gets talked about. Young people will go on to infect the elderly and the vulnerable, even as hard as they're trying to stay protected. So yes, contagion rates will continue to rise, and the death rate, which lags 2, 3, 4 weeks behind infection rates, will also increase. And those people, if there's a bell curve of voters where you have extremes of left or right, there's a lot of conservative leaning people in the middle who will be pushed away from Donald Trump. Yes. And that trajectory is visible. He's losing at least 2% support every month. So even whatever they do to Latino voters to disenfranchise people with African-American names and push them off the rolls, felons can vote now in Florida as well. So they can't pull a repeat of that particular 2000 trick. And so even if they are successful in disenfranchising millions of people of color, as they usually do, because they know that there's a strong overlap between people of color and Democratic supporters, they can't hold back the deluge of aggrieved white people now with a real actual grievance that someone is trying to kill them, and it's the Republican Party led by Donald Trump.
Wow. I do think that this is the really the blow. I mean it's amazing. It's amazing to have how little he actually had to do to ride this out. All he had to do was be moderately competent and not attack everybody and not attack it as a Democratic hoax. But there is so much footage, and he really doubled down, and then he tripled down on it being a hoax. And he twisted the arms. I mean, he removed signs in Tulsa last week. I mean, you know, for people to sit separately that were supposed to be there. He twisted the arms of the governors of these states, and it's extraordinary. And they acquiesced to him, and now they're going to, you know, they're sort of beginning to have to double back. But he is very invested in this going away and not being a bad thing or not being heard, and it's really just, you know, destroying him. And the other thing he did was calling out the military in Washington, D.C. on peaceful protesters. Yes. And I just want to express how unorthodox and what a historical anomaly that was. People say, well, the National Guard's been called out before. Not in this way. Not against peaceful protests, and not when the governor of those places, you know, hadn't asked them. And he also, you know,
there is no governor of Washington, D.C., is there?
There's a mayor.
There's a mayor, yeah.
There's a mayor who is ostensibly responsible, and there's Congress, which ostensibly has oversight for the city. Yes. But he, and cleared away the peaceful protests, used military helicopters to attack them. And he also had the 82nd Airborne, stationed in Virginia, like with 12,000 active duty paratroopers and troops ready to go at a moment's notice. And they shipped hundreds of thousands of rounds of live ammunition in case they needed to open fire to the fortress. I mean, and then the military made a statement that we are not to be used or misused, in this way. So
it was a misstep. He thought it would actually feed into the narrative of, here I am, the law and order president. You value me because I jettison normal standards and considerations. And that is the power that I give to you. And under fascism, normally that offer of that power is intoxicating to the base. But in this case, some more tentative Trump supporters were still repelled by that because of its unprecedented nature. Although what happened in Kent University, was that the National Guard?
That was the National Guard, yes.
Yes, and they were putting flowers in the rifles of the National Guard, but some National Guard then opened fire and killed some students. And that would have probably revolted a lot of Americans as well and been part of the turning of the tide of public opinion, perhaps against the war. I don't know.
He still got reelected, by the way.
Wow, after that happened.
Extraordinary. And they also opened fire, the National Guard, in a black university in the South, and also killed people there. But they were young people, the National Guard. They were untrained, and they were, going out for this law and order type of thing. It was a terrible tragedy. And it was, but it was seen as something that was really a turning point and something that ought not happen. It is good that the protests were peaceful, because Trump was sort of probably hoping that they would get less peaceful. Yes. And you really have to wonder who that white guy was in Minneapolis who was breaking the windows with the gas mask on. You've probably seen that picture.
Yes.
Who was he and who hired him? The Salt Lake City police said he's not one of us, but they didn't say that he didn't work for federal law enforcement or as a subcontractor to law enforcement.
Yes. Well, they said he wasn't the person they alleged he was. Not Jordan Peters, something like that.
Right.
But Trump clearly anticipated a Nixon-like response or a similar public response of, yes, okay, we'll still reelect you, and we're still tightly adherent to that narrative of good Republican law and order president, bad hippie public. And the public now is more on the side of the hippies than they were then, even though
the side of racial justice, but especially young people, and people are paying attention. I mean, we have this extraordinary tape of George Floyd's murder by police and people standing by, and everyone has to wonder, what do you do with something like this? This is a public lynching.
If people had footage of what was happening in Vietnam, if maybe they'd had some more footage of someone's death in that moment. But we saw George Floyd die, and he was dying from two people on him. I mean, there were three, but one on his lungs and one on his neck. And I say, yes, we disregard the hinge-pin medical autopsy because they were trying to emphasize drugs in Floyd's system and any atherosclerosis, any heart condition, as if to de-emphasize from the direct factors that killed him.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to contrast the fact that the commissioned autopsy, the family commissioned autopsy, said no, his lungs were compressed by a knee on his back, tiring out his diaphragm, making it difficult for him to breathe, as well as the compression of his trachea. And so that's multiple police officers directly involved in his death. And we saw at least the face, the calm, cool, collected, hands in pocket face of someone in the process of murdering someone else. And there wasn't any turning back from that for the public. So that's really been, I think, a critical difference now. So hopefully it won't be the same as Nixon's re-election. It feels that the public mood is different. There's so many,
we have, and there is, Biden does have experience, and it does not have. There was some baggage with George McGovern in '72. People who say the Republicans might get reelected. This is like 1972, and in USA. I think this election is Germany 1932, Dev. Yes. I think the parallels to Germany and 1932 are extraordinary. There was, unrest. There was people were worried about the communists, about the socialists. They were suppressing them in this, and there were fights and brawls in the street, and people were looking for a strongman. And what very few people realize is what percentage of the popular vote Adolf Hitler won in 1932. You know what it was?
Was it 33?
That's correct. Bing, 33%. And yet
I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and I came to this fight, even though I'm Australian and I don't live in America, because I could observe the emotional, rhetorical parallels between early fascism in Germany and this moment since 2015.
Yes. And that's what we're worried about, the Reichstag fire. And, yes. and when I talk about that false flag operation, it's what is going to be that Reichstag fire. I mean, everybody circles the wagon and salutes the flag, and we need a strong president. We need to stay the course because something like this is going on. I was in New York City, in Lower Manhattan. One of my past jobs as policy director for Lower Manhattan redevelopment for the New York City Council in the years after 9/11. So I was right there. I was in the quarantine area back then, and we were in Washington Square Park, which I was very much a part of the community there. We had protests not in our name that night. The idea that we do not want to see innocent civilians be killed in other countries based upon the suffering and this terrorist act. And, that really was used as an opportunity for the Iraq War, which had nothing to do with 9/11. Although if you poll Americans today, you ask, what was the nationality of the people aboard the planes that were hijacked on September 11th? More of them will identify them as Iraqis, which there were 0 Iraqis, than Saudi Arabians, which there were 11.
Was there 11 or 15? 15, wow.
Yeah.
And more stories come out about the involvement of the Saudi Arabian ambassador as well, and doesn't get much traction in people's consciousness.
No.
Which I guess is testament to the efficacy of the propaganda coming out of the government, which presumably had strong financial ties to the Saudi Arabians. I don't know. It seems as if a benevolent government would seek to correctly identify the nation that was most involved in an attack on America's soil like that, but
they didn't. They didn't, and that's an enduring question that will have to get addressed at some point. We see the consequences of leaving festering wounds open because Fox News is essentially like a large festering sore on the consciousness of America, because it's seeking to relitigate the Civil War in a subtle way. I have Rupert Murdoch, and I apologize for him. He is Australian, and he created Fox News. And he runs stories in Australian papers that say this particular crime was committed by an African. And he puts quotation marks around the African, like, I can't say African. They are African, but I have to put quotation marks.
And then the readers go, I'm smart enough to see those quotation marks. They're trying to trick us, aren't they, by making it a contested issue over whether or not it truly was Africans. So we know. So Rupert Murdoch knows how to create that element of mystery for the audience to solve. They can all.
I've followed Rupert Murdoch, well before you were born. I'm just saying that I've come from New York City in the media, and he had bought the New York Post, years ago. Yes. And what's extraordinary to me, Deb, is, not the scumbaggery and the vile corruption and the unbridled greed of Rupert Murdoch, because that we've seen since the beginning. It's actually James and Lachlan that shock me, because
isn't James the relatively good one, or you know more about this than me, I presume?
They're in control.
Yeah,
they're in control.
No, James get not disinherited, but he got pushed out of the operation.
No, they're back in, and they're
really,
yeah, and they're involved in overseeing Fox News, and they've been, given these questions as to, okay, and and they've got children who are going to live with the impact of climate change, and they've got, where Murdoch was worth, I did the Forbes 400, a few $1 billion. They're worth tens of billions of dollars because they sold Fox Studios and they've received so many payouts on what they've sold. So the idea that there was recently something this last year that they were presented with an option that who was fired from Fox News? There was a commentator who dared to tell the truth and criticize.
Seth. I'll remember his name in a minute.
But it was someone who who dared to criticize some of the others, and he was fired. And they brought it to them, the decision, and they were saying, well, we've got to stick with Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson because they've got higher ratings. And it's like, what difference does it make if the profits on your ad revenue for the Fox News network are $120 million a year profits for a quarter, or $80 million a year? It's not going to make a difference to your estate or your life or your kids.
Yes.
But the idea that they double down and triple down on their father's propaganda machine is extraordinary to me. It's like, where does the greed end?
It is a cultural war. It's not a race war. They want to protect what they have, and they can use their ability to amplify latent racism or amplify fear of communist takeover, etc. It's self-preservation writ large.
But what are they protecting? I mean, more specifically, I mean, Jeff Bezos is a Democrat, more or less, from the Washington Post. I mean, he's not worried about his billions disappearing.
They're protecting an empire, and their empire is contingent on their ability to not be held accountable for lying to the public. They need legislative easements for their empire and for their poor journalistic standards. So they need to be able to continue to lie to people, to cultivate this addictive system of news delivery, where you don't just deliver news, you deliver a sense of superiority. You deliver the Harvey Boys mysteries. Yeah, fear-mongering and making people feel like they're solving a special problem. It's like conspiracy theories, but milder, where you go, well, society tells us that we have to say alleged criminal. I wonder if you can guess who the real criminal is. Like, it's more subtle than that, but it gives the audience this very addictive sense of superiority, that they are defying public or popular opinion. They're defying the political correctness to solve the mystery of who's really to blame for the problems in society. It's really Black people, and it's really the Democrats. And they have this explanation that's a whole confected reality for them, that keeps them voting for Republicans who cut their social services, who cut Medicaid expansions and refuse federal aid, who really worsen their lives. I haven't read this book, and I always talk about how I want to read it, but have you read Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan Metzler? No. So he's done a lot of research into the self-defeating nature of a lot of Republican voting, and how he interviewed people across the country and found that they would describe how other people are addicted to government benefits, and then would refer to their own benefits that they were on, not as government payments. They're like, no, I'm not on any government payments. I just get veterans benefits and Medicare. Like they discounted those things as being from the government. So very compartmentalized, very delusional thinking that kept them in a position of repeatedly sabotaging their own future and their own community's future, etc. And it profits some people. It profits people like Rupert Murdoch because reality doesn't match the rest of the world. They can't go anywhere else for their news because that would cause them too much cognitive dissonance. He's so put them in a bubble that keeps them in Fox. You can't listen to anything else because that reality would just be too contrastive to what you know to be true because you've heard it multiple times. And that common sense is constructed by hearing things multiple times.
Well, this is what gets to the heart of, the American dilemma, political dilemma. And I do talk about that in the 6 essential cons that define Trump's success, which is con number 2, to win in politics, Trump makes voters believe that his presidency benefits them. And that's so when I wrote about that, scapegoating foreigners that's always been the mystery. How do working class and middle class people believe that this extraordinary, billionaire elite who who cuts his own taxes and who basically wants to cut their benefits is going to help them? But what I wrote is scapegoating foreigners for political gain is as old and tragically effective a tactic as appealing to racism. It is the same hate-mongering tune that stirs disempowered working-class white people to blame African Americans for their economic challenges. As President Lyndon Johnson said in 1960, if you could convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you.
Yes.
That was written 50 years ago.
Yes, and it's still true. Human nature has tendencies. They're adaptive or they're maladaptive, but we have tendencies to respond to different challenges. And one of them is tribalism, to frame an out-group and unite around an in-group. And fascists always do that. They always give you some prescribed values to unite around, that he's going to protect you, that he's the only one who will challenge this weakness, this dilution of self-interest, because that's how they categorize Democrats. And to a degree, it's true, because there are two parties for a reason. One pursues justice, and the other is supposed to pursue pragmatism, so that they complement each other and neither go too out on a limb. And they both rein each other in and operate as a check and balance, but two competing human directives: to be compassionate, to be kind, to help others, and then the other, not to extend yourself too thinly so that your family is left unprotected, but to reel in some of your outreach. And Fox and the whole conservative media system have convinced Americans they are stretched so thin. So it's always interesting to look at areas where Americans are most deluded. What do Americans get wrong the most? They often overestimate the amount of foreign aid that they give out, to the tune of millions of dollars of overestimation. And they overestimate the strength of America's social security system. So they think everybody's on incredibly generous payments, and they think lots of people on them, and they overestimate the proportion of Black people that are on them. They underestimate the proportion of white people that use government benefits. So those discrepancies really clue us into where messaging needs to be stronger in order to fix this problem, because those delusions are not without consequence. When you have a critical mass of incredibly deluded people, they're not just sabotaging themselves anymore, they're sabotaging America and consequently the planet. Because I'm with you on that whole climate justice for not only ourselves and our children, but people in other countries that are hit hardest by increasing temperatures. And we're all hit. I mean, we're all at an increased likelihood of suffering through an extreme weather event. But
okay, well, I'm going to wind down. It's almost an hour. Is there anything, we've solved all the world's problems, Dav, and that's been a pleasure. Is there anything else you'd like to ask me about specifically?
Well, I'm going to go back and read you a piece of the 6 essential cons of Donald Trump. But I guess I'd most like to ask you as a final question then about the time that Donald Trump called you masquerading as John Barron. How was your reaction on realizing how much Donald Trump could compound that deception so that he deceived you, and that deception was then used to say, well, look, Banks, you don't need to look too closely at my records because I'm on the Forbes 400. What did you feel like when you realized that he was able to parlay that deception into bigger and bigger deceptions?
Well, I mean, what's fascinating is that, I mean, he was a problem for the Forbes 400 editors, and the staff. I left there after some years and I helped with it, but by the end of the 80s, I wasn't helping with it anymore. And he was other people's problem because he constantly lobbied. But it wasn't until I found the tape, like after he got elected, that I realized that John Barron wasn't, that I had a tape of it. And I deconstructed these two 40-minute interviews and realized how deliberate the con was. And it was astonishing. I mean, I played this tape for a really big editor and they listened to it and they were like, how did you not get that? And so there's a level of embarrassment about it that it's like, how could I not get that? At the time, I mean, his secretary told me that I had more access to him than any other reporter in the country, except the New York Times guy who he hated his guts, the architecture critic. But it's that
niceness bias. You had niceness bias. You would have never conceived that someone would, or someone so important, so reputedly wealthy, would lower themselves to pretend to be a non-existent person and call you.
Well, I knew he was lying to me, Deb, when I did interview him in person. I mean, I interviewed him in person before he did the phone call thing. So there was a separation of a year between the last personal interviews and the phone call interview. But I couldn't imagine, but I knew he was lying to me, and I was shocked, even as a young man of 22 years old when I first met him, that he could be so insecure as to take credit for what his father did and lie so transparently and think that I was such an idiot, I wouldn't get it. But he moves the guidepost. I thought I was doing a good job holding him down to just $100 million when he was actually worth $5 million. I thought I was doing a good job because he was saying he was worth 500 or 800 million.
So it's a niceness bias. Even when we think, oh, we know they're lying to us, we still don't anticipate the extent to which they're lying to us and the extraordinarily shameless level of deceit.
Yes, the extraordinary shameless. And how I felt was when I did learn all of it, I recognized that there is there's an extent of that. If I, and I've told this to some people, it's a pretty crazy story. There was, he had done a filing with the Atlantic City Casino Control Commission for New Jersey, in which he had told him what his actual net worth was. And it was in a file cabinet in Atlantic City. He did have like a cozy type of relationship with him. I don't know that they would have given me the file. Theoretically, it was public record. But if I had known, if someone had called me and said, Jonathan, there's a folder, go to Jersey City and pick this up and you'll see what Donald Trump is really worth. And I looked at that and said, oh my gosh, he shouldn't be on the Forbes 400. And if he didn't get on the
$5 million, is that's what he had at that point?
He had less than $5 million. He had $400,000 in the bank. He had a car. He didn't even own his own apartment at the time. But he had a trust fund that gave him, $1 million a year that had a certain value, but you couldn't cash it out. But his net worth was probably somewhere around that area of $5 to $10 million. He really didn't, and he didn't own anything that his father owned, and he told me he owned most of it. But if I had known that, and he wasn't on the Forbes 400, the thing to understand is I was the expert on New York real estate. There were a dozen other people in New York who were worth over $100 million who were on that list. And any banker who we went into and he said, I'm Donald Trump, look how much I'm worth. I want to borrow $200 million. Look what even Forbes has me down at this.
Yes.
They would have said, look, you're not real, on the list. And he'd be like, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. That guy Greenberg's an idiot, which he did do. He called the editor in to interview him after me. And he said, you got it all right. There's nothing to change. He was lobbying Malcolm Forbes from the very beginning. But if if I had not put him on and everyone else was on, he would have had trouble borrowing that money. He probably would not have been able to borrow that money. As Trevor Noah said on The Daily Show, it was the origin lie, the bullshit foundation upon which he built his entire bullshit career.
Yes, he leveraged that bullshit into more money, and to then
not be president today.
Yeah.
If I was not conned, in 1982 and 83. So part of me is like, okay, I've been used as this media person in a way to elevate him, and now I think it's up to me. I have a choice in the matter. I could use my skills and my capacity and the unusual insight I have into him to, try to make sure that he doesn't get reelected.
Well, thank you. Thank you for turning your talents to that important pro-social end. I often encourage my viewers to turn whatever decency, whatever ability they have to string two words together, to write letters, to be public, to be visible with their opposition to the indecency of Trump and the Republican Party, to build coalitions wherever they can. But you're coming from a particularly insightful background with those decades of experience, and being one of the people who helped him with the foundational lie, although of course everybody has helped him with that lie, because he knew how to ingratiate himself with the tabloids, how to turn every bit of public exposure into the mythology of Trump and his gold toilets, to make himself the archetype of American success. And you were saying in your novel, where you've got the matriarchy, or the ideal state under a force field. Oh my gosh, how much would people love to build a force field between themselves and Donald Trump's government? How much would they love that right now?
Yes.
It would be great. Impervious to coronavirus.
But I just want to say, in terms of what people could do and empowerment, this is something I am a longtime political activist, beyond, my journalism, and I do what's called public interest advocacy. Is that, a lot of us feel hopeless, or helpless. What can I do? I'm just one person. I'm just one vote. And what I say to people is that have that uncomfortable conversation with your Aunt Sally or your Grandpa Tom. When you don't want to talk about politics, just speak honestly and from the heart. And if each of us could get one or two or three people in a swing state who either believes that they don't need to vote because there's no reason to do it, or they're going to vote for Trump to change their vote, we could completely change and transform electoral politics in the United States. It's really, if you want to be the change you want to see, and people really don't want to have this conversation. Most of us are not like me or you. Most of us are conflict averse and really don't want to bring up politics. But
yes.
And by the way, you talk about those suburban women. My sister, who is in Pennsylvania, works with people. She has never even wanted to talk about politics. She changes the subject. She reminds me that we're not talking. Ever since Trump, she's joined the ACLU. She's on it like completely. It's shocking. She has been totally activated, by his candidacy. And I think there are millions of people who feel the same way. And what we need to do is just sway those one or two people, take the time and take the interest to listen to them and to try to get them to vote, against Trump.
Yes, that's an important hostage negotiation technique that I learned from a YouTube ad. You repeat the last three words you heard from the hostage taker. And in this case, the hostage taker is that person you're trying to win over. And there are people who are more winnable than others. The people who don't think they need to vote, those people are probably an easier task to convince than your Trump-crazed uncle. So the person who's like, oh, all politicians are corrupt, I don't need to do anything. They all are in it for themselves. So you repeat back, oh, they're all in it for themselves. But are there some people whose self-interest is maybe more harmful to other people? Some people who maybe save face as a president.
Well, what I said to that person is, is what you're saying that you feel it's going to make no difference to your life, this 25-year-old man, or the life of your children, your family in the future, whether the next president is Bernie Sanders or whether it's Donald Trump. At the time, that's what I said, that it's not going to make a difference. And that made him think, a little bit. He began to backtrack on that. And I could see that his fiance, who's my friend's daughter, was looking at him like, like we're going to have this conversation. Oh,
that's good. So you did it publicly as well. You shamed him in front of his fiance. Smart, but not in a way that was hostile.
What I did is I listened to him.
Yeah,
I got
you
it.
invited him to reflect.
And that's the thing, is it's not shaming, and your curiosity, and this is what I've learned as a journalist and in political discourse as well. It really needs to be genuine and authentic. You really do. I really do want to know why he's not going to vote. So what is there? And so all of them, they're all the same. They're in it for themselves. And so, okay, so instead of saying, oh my gosh, you're this or that, or you're stupid, or let's change the subject, it's like, so is what you were saying that it makes that Bernie Sanders is the same as Donald Trump in terms of his self-interest? I'm not aware that Bernie Sanders has ever, cheated people or stolen money. I think he's worth, he makes a couple of 100,000 a year, except the year he had his book, and anyway.
You would not like my opinions about Bernie Sanders. No. No, I mean, I'm on a political continuum. I'm all in favor of guardrails for capitalism, etc. But I have some stridently different opinions about Sanders' role in the 2016 election. I won't burden you with them now. Okay. I'll just highlight and reinforce the technique that you described, which is asking people questions. And I thought, yes, maybe it's better if we frame it as, instead of a conversion project, we investigate people. Let's talk to people and find out why they don't want to vote, because we might not be able to convert them, but we might learn more about what's motivating them, and that will help us shape our questions and our statements in the future. So then if we have that lowered expectation of, I'm not going to convert you, I'm just going to learn about you, sometimes you can do more when you have lower expectations.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it removes the tension. Yeah. And we'll know in the back of our head that, yes, ultimately our goal is to help people vote and be motivated to vote. Mm-hmm. But yeah,
and I do believe Biden is, you could say that about, will it make, what does our future look like with Biden? What are we risking? And what does our future look like with Trump, and what are we risking? And what I think we're risking with Trump is that spinoff of 1984, a fascist dictatorship.
Yes. And I like that we seem less crazy now, that there's more people on board with saying that Trump is an autocrat, the clearing of protesters from Lafayette Park with armed military forces, and having live ammunition in standby, and having helicopters buzzing people on the ground. All of those things make our assertions from years now. I'm imagining you've been years on this case as well, of saying, recognize an autocrat when you see one.
Oh yeah, and he's so divorced from reality. I mean, to say that George Floyd is smiling today, I mean, it's like you can't. I've written some fiction as well. If you put this in a comedy sketch about a fictitious president, and you put a line like that, people would be like, Dad, it's a little too far from the, no one's going to believe that.
Rein your fiction in, make it more plausible.
Tone it down, make it more. He defies it, and I hope that will do, that will do his undoing. I mean, and I hope that he can't stop himself from sticking his bone spur foot in the mouth. Oh, and this business about Russia, I see you've been mentioning it. And I mean, it's the question is, and I'll leave you with this because I do have to go, and I appreciate, your time.
You need a drink. I've been sipping water, but I've made you talk for an hour without anything.
Well, no, I haven't. Here we go.
You've got it.
Is, whether there's a piece out today that he's feeling very fragile, and people are talking about him resigning. Or giving up if he really believes he can't get reelected. And I think the reason he may resign is so that Pence could pardon him before he leaves election. So I've been researching a little bit about Ford's pardon of Nixon.
Yes.
It happened within 2 months of him resigning.
Resigning.
And it was a pardon. Someone asked me the big question, legal question, because I have some legal background, journalism background, whether it was for specific crimes and Trump's, and it was not. It was for anything that happened while he was president.
Oh, wow. Just this blanket pardon.
It's a blanket pardon to stop the Congress from going after him for his, for his crimes. So I think that Trump might do that if, come the convention, he believes that he's got no chance. And if, as the trend line suggests, Arizona, Texas, and Florida and Georgia fatalities go so much higher that he's behind more than 5 points in each of those states. So I think it's one or the other. I think he might actually either resign or declare a state of emergency. And I hope it's the first and not the second.
Yes. Well, fingers crossed. Is that your phone? I'll let you answer it. Thank you so much for talking with me today, Jonathan. It's been a delight. I'm not from a journalistic background, but I felt called to this task of being someone who communicates on these topics because of the nature of Trumpism and the fact that it does intoxicate people with that power of cruelty, the power of releasing yourself from humanitarian considerations and normal rule of law considerations even as well. So I love talking to other people who have that as their mission and who talk about ways to turn out the vote to inspire others. It's been awesome finding out more details from your background, that call that John Barron made to you to try to get on the Forbes 400 list and how he leveraged that. That's been so great to talk more with you about that. And I conceivably, again, will talk to you someday in the future with any luck once you're
okay. Yeah. Hopefully we'll be celebrating Biden's victory.
Oh, that would be awesome.
We talk about how it all happened. Or sometime sooner. But thank you, Dav. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I'll click end broadcast and then I can say thank you some more. Hang on. I'll say bye to the audience. Kerry Pilots just realized that Jonathan received that call. I haven't been looking at the comments, but I peripherally noticed that they were reinforcing what you were saying about Trump and the Republican Party. But yes. Thanks, audience. Take care.
Thank you.
All the best. All right. So that's ended